Okay, thank you. Well, let's try that again then. I'd just say that in addition to the strategy groups, the driver groups have been forming. The difference would be that the strategy groups have had more of a team and a little longer to work on these. So we're pretty preliminary, but hopefully we can guide through this discussion and get some feedback and input. So I've got 8 short slides. I'll share one at a time, but we're very open for feedback and discussion as we go along. So Kathleen and I have talked briefly, and don't be shy about speaking up and helping us go through this. Jeff Bradshaw is doing this remotely. Jeff, I believe you're still in your professional meetings, or thanks for joining in. So let me see if I can share and are you seeing a slide now that says Nebraska Extension and webinar?
We are not, Jack.
Oh boy. I thought I did just what I did last time, but apparently not.
There you go.
That it? Thanks. Generally, the topic and the discussion will revolve around impact, and our objective is to get a little better idea of what does it mean and how do we know when it happened. I mentioned myself, Kathleen, Jeff Bradshaw, and I believe Larry Van Tassel. I don't know if Larry's on.
Larry is on. Thanks, Larry, for being a part of this team.
Great. Thanks, Larry. Are the ones that have been trying to guide this. I wanted to start with first some wording about what a driver is and how they came about. I know there's been a fair amount of email traffic and webinar traffic, and I thought it was helpful, might be helpful just to put this in context. So these are words from the original kind of discussion and invitation to become involved as we move toward Extension 2025. So success drivers are influencers of long-term success and effectiveness of Extension. Drivers move us forward. And so department heads, the Extension leadership team were asked a couple of questions to identify these drivers. As I mentioned, the one that we're working with is impact. There are others that you've seen through the email, and there have been other webinars about. So again, this is from the material that was put forward by the Dean and others. The gold standard of Extension work is impact, sometimes characterized as change in behavior or practice on the part of learners that we engage as Extension educators and specialists. Impact is influenced by the relevance of the program, ability to engage learners, resources available, obviously what can be invested toward that, and then in addition, ideas such as leading and lagging indicators. I believe we can talk a little bit more about that as we frame this question. I guess we could, I can just go through these slides, but if there's discussion, we just well do it right now. So maybe rather than flip through all the slides in a hurried fashion, why don't I pause and see if there are clarifying or additional questions or comments, rather, as we move toward this.
So, and our intent today is to really get ideas from each of you on this particular driver impact and what that would look like and some things we can think about around that. So it really is an open dialogue. There hasn't been a lot of pre-work on this. We want the influence from the system. Just be thinking about that.
This cartoon struck a chord with me as I looked at it, and you probably can read it yourself, but it's a an assistant, maybe a librarian, who knows what the one cartoon character is representing, but talking to a researcher that says, it's all well and very well making discoveries, saving lives, and improving the world, Roger. Roger must be the man in the white coat. But our research is barely making any impact on social media. You know, I think the definition of impact changes as we move farther and farther in technology. But going back to what was said earlier about change in behavior and change in practice, however that's measured, I believe is the main part of what we're discussing here. So as was mentioned, and Kathleen kind of clarified, that our objective today is to frame the question and then to begin to make some recommendations for improvement in this general area of impact. So this is expanded a little bit more, identify 1 to 3 outcomes that describe what we want to be different. And then secondly, 1 to 3 recommendations along that line. Reminder, as was pointed out in some of the strategy groups, recommendations about suggesting direction but not specific action items. Really clear about expectations of impact, the way supervisors communicate and assess those expectations, and the resources we need to invest to strengthen our impact assessment efforts. We may need to discuss that a little bit, Kathleen, in regard to our conversation with Chuck yesterday. I'd say there's still a little unclarity in my mind as to whether this is related to evaluating impact or the purpose of impact.
Yeah. So I think as we think about this, as we think about extension as a system, we do lots of different kinds of evaluation, and certainly we want to best tell our story. So I think today what might help us the most is if we just had some conversations about what are the ways that we want to be able to tell the story of our work, certainly to our clients and also to our supervisors, but big picture extension system, how our personal work might fit into that, but this is a bigger than just me sharing my personal impact with my supervisor. Okay, we can get into that like a little bit deeper in the weeds later, but as an extension system, what kinds of things do we need to be thinking about related to impact and how we tell that story? And one of the things that I think makes it a little bit more of a challenge for us, and this is why we're really glad that Larry Van Tassel is on this call and this topic, we have some hard science kinds of things that we do, and certainly we can talk about that. We also do lots of work in the more social science world, and it's sometimes harder to measure the impact of our work in those areas because it's not rate of gain on an animal and it's not bushels per acre. But it's more behavior change. So I think what we're talking about in the bigger picture, how could we best tell our story and what do we want that to look like? Does that help for people all? Maybe we just have an open dialogue because I know that's not as clear as we'd like it to be, but I think that's what we're kind of struggling with today or talking about. You can unmute your phone and say things, or you can chat in the chat box.
Kathleen, this is Jill. One of the things that's hard for me to wrap my brain around as I think about just 4-H and then, of course, broader extension too, is how we would narrow down maybe our expectations around behaviors that we want to be able to measure and track over time. Is the way our current logic models are designed, I don't know if there's as much consistency in behaviors, which isn't a bad thing, but then we're looking at multiple strategies. And when you're talking about assessing at that level or beyond, it starts to get more complicated and more expensive than some of the things we currently do. So is there I don't know, maybe a goal to try to hone in on a certain short list of behaviors that we really want to measure across extension.
I'm taking notes, by the way, so if you hear clicking, that's it. If it gets too distracting, I'll turn on mute. But I want to keep, I want to capture all of this, and I want to keep the conversation going. So based on Jill's question, other thoughts, what does that look like? Would that be helpful to us around the behavior piece? Can we come to agreement on something that would be across content area?
I'll just add that I'm thinking about that only in trying to think about the next steps after that, because right now a lot of the program evaluation we do is focused on the short term because it's more accessible for us to get that data. So if we're ratcheting it up to behavior change, and that strategy is going to be a little bit more rigorous, is that something that we could share more broadly?
And is that the best thing that we want to evaluate? Like, as you think about the people that you talk to, our clients, our decision makers, our county commissioners, the people who make decisions about our budgets, like state senators and Board of Regents members, are those the kinds of things that they want, or is there a better way to show our impact?
Well, it is a hard area to define. And as Kathleen pointed out, I think the challenge is that some of these things don't happen immediately, and we move on to other things, and kind of forget to wrap around, 5 and 10 and 20 years later, and try and do an assessment at that point. So establishing a clear process when we begin a new program or so on as to how to quantify that and the frequency is, I think, an important part as we do our planning.
I'll just throw out another question related to that then too. Are we evaluating too many things? And we decide, kind of to Jack's point, that we do a deep dive on these 2 things or 3 things or whatever we decide, and the rest we don't worry about, or worry about it in a different way.
One thing that seems to me over time is that when I've done a really deep look at farmers that have made changes, when I've called about programs, 2, 3, 4 years later, is that many of them say, well, yeah, I've made several changes there, but whether extension was what drove that, I don't know. You got me to thinking about it. And then I'd see an article in the Farm Magazine. I'd talk to a neighbor about this topic, on and on and on. And so at some level, when you're saying what's the right question, sometimes if we can set the agenda, get people, I've kind of always said one of my main jobs is to create a good, healthy dissatisfaction with status quo on whatever topic I'm trying to influence people in. And so I'm not sure how you ask that question. I've never came up with a good idea, but at some level, just getting people to start thinking about a topic and even the people that write farm magazines and the people that do radio commentaries and the local newspapers, and they start picking up, and all of a sudden this topic, there's a lot of sources out there and other government agencies. So to say that, that's always a challenge when you get down the road a few years. Farmers or anyone that's really tried to improve in that area, they're not very colorblind, if you will, to where they find the information. It's wherever they see something useful, they're going to take a look at it. And so I'm not sure how we ask that question, but it seems to me that when you move down the road, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, you've really got to somehow assess, did we kick off this thought process in the individual's mind or not? And that's really foggy, several years later.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to, even with pretty high-tech research tools, to attribute exactly what caused a change in behavior. There's lots of things going on in the world of education.
Well, there is. And so maybe that's not even quite the right question. I mean, that's the one everybody wants to know, right? And then they want to tie an economic number to it. But, you know, maybe there's some short-term kind of thing asking around that type of a question. You know, did this raise your awareness of an issue here? Did it help you set a goal to improve in this area? You know, maybe that's almost more of an appropriate way to ask the question and do it pretty short term, because I mean, shoot, I know I don't. If you ask me 6 months later about something, I might remember that I know it, but I may not remember where it came from, even on a, you know, fairly trivial kind of fact.
And I think that's where we get into that topic that Jack had in his slide about leading and lagging indicators.
Sure, absolutely. That's exactly what that's describing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe to those kind of comments, it's trying to follow a smaller population of our participants over time, knowing that we won't necessarily in a long-term strategy keep everyone responding, but maybe a more meaningful targeted strategy with a small group who would invest in a longer term process with us. And then the other thing I was thinking about, and I know we often have this conversation and have tried to do this and have done this in some places, is how can we tie to secondary data that's already out there and make that part of our story and leverage what's being collected. We may not be able to, as just was mentioned, show like we were the only catalyst or cause towards that, but can we make meaningful connections maybe through some even qualitative assessment strategies with our clients about the influence we might have had on trends that are already being measured.
Let's talk about that one a little bit more, because what we're finding is there's some merit to being able to use secondary data, as you all know, because it's like we don't have to do the work. Someone else kind of does the collection for us. What would that look like? Any ideas of pieces we might use there, or if that would work, how that would work?
Some comments, Kathleen, in the chat box around the idea of getting more qualitative or anecdotal feedback. What if we could marry those two responses in some way, like with a group of participants in our programs, having ongoing discussions and capturing qualitative feedback as we watch secondary data trends change over time.
Any thoughts around that? All the rest of you can join in too.
Jeff, you're typing in the chat box. If you're comfortable, why don't you maybe describe what you're putting in the chat box, if you're able to do that and willing to.
Well, one thing, it's kind of what Jill was talking about by second-hand data. We talked about it Monday on that driver conversation, is can we use like the rural poll that goes out every year and having very well constructed 1 or 2 questions that secondary organization is providing some feedback or impact data that goes out throughout all of Nebraska. And so we're able to very specifically target a question that we have without it necessarily overcoming from us.
Someone's in a place with a lot of background noise. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that may be Jeff. I believe he's in the airport. So
Yeah.
I think your chat
I was just going to say, I'm sitting in the airport, so I'm not sure if it's too
You're going to have to
fast for me
chat, Jeff. Sorry.
I suppose everybody can read in the chat box as was referred to, but I think one of the points Jeff makes is that there are a number of groups, nonprofit or otherwise, that struggle with measuring long-term behavior. And so it's not unique to us, but at the same time, if we were to look back at the impact of, and I'll be a little specific in the sense of land grant universities on agriculture in the U.S., certainly there's been a continual improvement that's taken place by all the things that go into research, education, and teaching. To quantify it in a specific, one or two things that made a difference, I don't, that would be a challenge, but things like the show and tell, and then these individual stories by, as Jeff says, universally recognized influencers, I think all play a part in moving the needle in the directions that we've seen move. And I don't think it's just land grants, but it's that idea of coordinated effort in learning and then applying.
So what would look different if we spent more time and energy around impact as a driver? If we said for the next 12 months, we're going to really dig deeply and put resources into impact and measuring program impact for Nebraska Extension, at the end of the year, next year, what would be better about us, or what would look different?
An area that I'm interested in, and I'm trying to learn more about, and if impacts was a big driver, is maybe using the concept of these ripple effect impact drivers. So it's kind of like throwing a rock into a lake. So I have direct contact with one individual, but then they go home and they tell somebody else, and then they tell somebody else. So you get that ripple effect. And I really think about youth education in particular. So I go into a third grade classroom and I talk about ag literacy, but they go home and they tell mom and dad, and then mom and dad tell something. And so you have a larger impact spectrum than what we're currently seeing because of that constant learning to the next person. And wonder if that would be something of value, especially in the youth education component, but in all components of our education programs.
Yeah, I agree in all. As you think about when we teach families about nutrition through our SNAP program, they go back and talk about that, and then other families might be influenced if they're with their friends or their colleagues. We know that around the coffee table at the local coffee shop, farmers are talking about different strategies they use in their production units. Some of those are influenced by us.
And along those lines, when we bring people together for some kind of a learning activity, the social capital that is developed there as individuals work with other individuals, and what's been found is they reach back to those individuals and ask questions, and they start conversations that move them further down the road. And so that's one of the things we haven't measured very well in the past, is the social capital that is built up through our activities.
What else would look differently? Would we be using more secondary data like we talked about before? So I'm going to just throw this out because to me this would be a gift. If we didn't have to send out so many questionnaires and be collecting data forms and all of that stuff for each program, but rather we had a place where we initially worked really hard to have the right questions, like somebody said before, but then that data were collected for us, and then we got it back and it came out in something meaningful. Would that be helpful to people?
Pretty quiet bunch, Kathleen.
I'll speak up. My producers would be excited that they didn't have to fill out any evaluation every time they see me. And in my heart, I believe we would get better quality data than what we currently get. I see a lot of them just circle right in the middle because it's quick and done and I can leave without really putting a thought process into it.
What about the rest of you?
I also wonder about that data being in real time, interactive, so people can see growth and impact wherever it may be, but it's in real time, not just something that we create all the time. So like when you're showing the impact of something, that it would show it in real time instead of us creating at certain points of time. Does that make sense?
Well, unpack that a bit for me. What would that look like? Give me a program example and what would that look
So
like?
Tableau is a perfect example. It's going to give you real-time information and it'll give you pie bar charts. Pairs is another one that it's in real time that can be somewhere showing that impact or that growth or whatever it may be. So if I'm searching for something and Googling something, it might be something that would pop up and they would like, oh, I didn't know Extension was doing that, and be able to share that with them to drill in further that, oh yeah, I really want to go to that program because I'll grow in that area and be more of an expert or something to that effect.
So true good, that's still contingent on getting data entered
Yep.
in a timely basis. I mean, and there is also some risk with that if you set it up for a lifetime and you don't screen those results before they go out.
True.
So some of you are parts of programs that by design have a national or regional reporting base. Would our worlds be better if we had more of those kinds of things? Should we look for more of those? And I'm thinking those is different than like a roll poll or a NASIS, but more like a pairs or a common measures. I don't know as many on the ag side, but things that have some regional or even sometimes national indicators and tools. We want more of those, less of those? What do you think?
I'll offer in theory, I like those kinds of systems a lot. It'd just be investigating the options that are out there and deciding if they overlap with functions and features we already have in place.
Anybody been hearing about new ones of those that are interesting?
Maybe step back and pursue what Angie was saying a bit more, and then Jill's comment. Jill, as you mentioned that, I guess in a way, my thought went, have you had experiences where, because the data was real time, there were inappropriate or embarrassing sort of things? Or maybe just expand on that. What's the risk versus reward? Because I'd kind of say with Angie as well that in today's automatic information world, a graph, a feedback immediately may have superiority as compared to, like Amy said, of having them fill out a sheet that they don't see the immediate response, both from themselves and then from their colleagues and how they compare. So anyway, my question to Jill is, or maybe for the whole group, but when doing these things, are there situations where the negative is some way or the inappropriate thing has come forward.
I'll start and just say I have not had a negative experience with that, but in the way that I imagine it working, we have some reporting templates we currently use, and there's just almost always in the series of questions that we would collect information on, some that we're more excited about sharing not because they're good or bad results, but because we think they're more meaningful to the stakeholders. So you'd have to think really carefully about what you're going to allow to be automated and pushed out so that you're not overwhelming a potential viewer with a bunch of charts when there's really only one or two things that are of interest to them. So it doesn't allow you that tailored approach. On the flip side, Angie's point is exactly right. It's real time, it's accessible, it doesn't necessarily mandate the reporting and compiling kind of process that we're in now. So not a negative experience or anything, just sort of trying to play that out in my mind about how that information would be then public if that's how we opted to share it. The other conversations we're regularly having with some of the other youth development evaluators is just about this idea of data literacy. So it's one thing to share your data out there, but not being available to unpack that with your potential stakeholder and put it in context of qualitative information or stories or the kinds of photos or reports that you might author to go along with it or presentations you might give is also feels a little bit cold. Like, okay, I've got these charts and graphs, but it doesn't give them necessarily all the context that we might want them to have around data. So we're having a lot of conversations around just data literacy efforts in general, and how can we help make that more palatable or received by the learner or by the stakeholder in the package that we want them to receive it in. But
that's making sure that they totally understand.
Definitely more timely.
Somebody else was saying something. One of the other things I've heard about the live data is I think the jury is still out on how much our answers influence each other. If I see everybody else pressing the loved it key or changed my knowledge key, and I really didn't feel that way, there can be the risk of groupthink. And so I don't know if we've had enough research yet to show what that risk really is and whether it's high enough to worry about. So I've got down 3 potential outcomes that we talked about, and I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to show you those and see if they are what we think makes sense. Can you see a Word document now that says identifying 1 to 3 outcomes that describe what we want to be different?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I was just taking notes, so this is your time to fact check, right? Are these the things that we think could be different if we focus more on impact? And are these the things that we want?
I am wondering if number 3 should be changed instead of real-time. Data literacy strikes me that is probably more of what we want people to understand more than anything, no matter how our information is shared, either in the real time or whatever. But I think there's a component to that maybe that statement should be revised.
Is that for our client would have more data literacy? We'd have more data literacy? Who are you thinking there, Angie?
I'm thinking so our clientele will have more data literacy, but I don't know. I guess I would throw that back to the group.
like that. Other thoughts? Are these what we want? What's going to happen with these next is, let me get the real process down here. These are going to be part of fall conference, okay, because this might help you decide if these are the right things we want to talk about. So what we're going to do is have groups get together around these, and you'll get a choose among all the driver groups that are meeting as we speak. And then what that group would do is come up with some recommendations around this driver. So here's the outcomes, and then we're going to move here in a couple minutes to some recommendations that would help move that forward. So that would be the work of in a small group. And then based on those recommendations, we're going to pitch a couple of these recommendations to the bigger fall conference group, right? So each driver group will come up with 1 to 3 recommendations. We'll give our pitch of our top 2 ideas to the bigger group. And then the whole group will help us decide which, if any, of those recommendations are ones that we should actually pursue moving ahead as a system. So the idea here is to be really transparent and really have all of you shape some of the big pieces of what we'll do next and how that influences us as a system. So we want these things to be things that we think are pretty important. And if we don't have 3, we don't have 3. If we have 4, we might have to whittle it down. But that's why I want input from as many people as possible on this. Think about what that looks like. Would the world of extension be better if these were the kind of things we were talking about related to impact?
Kathleen, in looking at the overall objective here, one of the things I think is important is that everyone realize that you don't have to develop impacts for everything you're doing. I think if people understand that you might have 1 program, maybe 2, you're involved with that really lends itself to obtaining impacts, and then it would make it more manageable so they didn't have to think they have to go try to get impacts for everything they try to do.
No, I think that is a really good point. And we're hearing that more consistently now. We were before counting and measuring absolutely everything. And I think, Larry, what you're saying is we can be more purposeful about the programs where we measure impact, and the rest we don't. People agree with that? Disagree?
I agree.
Can I go back to number 2? And I may have missed, well, somebody clarify, give an example of secondary data. I suppose that's the ABC down there, but maybe just expand on what's meant by the secondary data.
Basically, it's data gathered by some other entity that's gathered on or somewhat of a regular basis, like NASS data or like the Census of Agriculture organizations. And, the rural poll's a good one, but, they might not always be targeting the exact questions you're wanting to address. But for example, if you want to take a look and see if cover crops is taking hold in Nebraska, and you can trend that out by using NASS data or Census of Ag, but you can't always say that it's attributed to extension. But you're using other data sources that are collected by other entities.
Jill, you might want to give the example that we've been using in 4-H about moving the needle on youth development.
So Kathleen, are you referencing the clearinghouse project that we're working on?
Well, that's a good one too. Go for that one.
Okay, so a little bit different in that there's a partnership approach here, but the National Clearinghouse collects data on where young people go on to higher education, the institutions they land at, the majors they're pursuing, and then tracks them through persistence and graduation. And so we're able to submit a list of youth who were in 4-H at the time of graduation, and then run that list against their larger database, and they'll send us back a report for where youth who were in 4-H in Nebraska through graduation have now gone on to college. And then our plan after this initial wave of collection is to double check that same list of kids in 6 years. That's the recommended timeline they offer, to then go back and check to see if they graduated. So it's a little different, and we're not just taking the data. There's a partnership in that they're running a data set for us against their data.
And so I think there's two kinds of things here. Like the National Clearinghouse has things that they already collect, and we're going to work with them and do that piece. There's opportunities for us to put questions, to pay for questions on surveys at the state level at least. Like the rural poll, I think we can pay to have questions on that. NASIS, we can pay to have questions on that. So we can consistently decide every year for the next 5 years or whatever, we want to ask this question. We won't know if those things are attributable to our work, but we will know if that needle has changed for Nebraskans. And we think like that's our overall goal. Yeah, we'd like it to be attributed to us, but if we can move the needle, all the better. If we can get more cover crops, perfect. Is it us only? Is it us with someone else? You know, at the end of the day, it's all good. So there's that kind of look. Does that help, Jack?
Mm-hmm. It does. That's very helpful, the discussion and clarification.
You know, Kathleen, when we talked earlier about like trying to be creative about qualitative data along with that, it might be a kind of design where, let's say that we followed a group of kids through the clearinghouse and they graduated, and then we could try to pull together a focus group of recent graduates from that particular class to then really try to unpack and talk with them about the potential influence that 4-H may have had on that trajectory for them. So that'd be a way to sort of try a couple of those strategies together.
And the ones I'm most familiar with are on the social science side, because that's my work. Now, the Census of Ag is one. Are there other ones that are out there in the ag world or the water world that would help us do this? I just don't know.
Kathleen, is NASIS, is that something, or I'm not familiar with that. I know there's NASS, National Ag Statistical Service, NASS, that would be one that would be up there.
NASS, Nebraska Ag, or National. No, the other one, I might not have the right acronym up there, Jill. It's the Nebraska one.
For the NASIS?
Yeah.
No, that's right. I'm not sure exactly what that stands for, but
we pay to have questions on that one. Nebraska Ag.
It's the Bureau of Sociological Research's annual study.
Nebraska Annual Social Indicators Survey.
Thank you. There's more of these on the social science side. Like there's a huge youth risk one that we've used before. And so like from that, we know that smoking trends are down, for example, or drinking is down or whatever.
There are a number of government surveys that are out there.
Okay.
They have we now have that data center here that we can get access to a lot of government data out there. And I'm not that familiar with all of it, but I know there is a boatload of data that can be accessed and analyzed.
And that data center is like a campus data center, Larry?
There are so many data centers. It's the Social Science Research Bureau, and we've got a center in conjunction with Iowa State, and so it's it's here on campus. You have to go through some training and you have to access it within their lab. You can't, that type of thing. But there are a large number of government data sets out there.
Okay, great discussion. Jack, do you think that we're ready to move on to some recommendations?
Yeah, I do. I think in the interest of time, then also maybe this is primed the pump a little more so we can come to some recommendations.
So what do you think? If we were going to move forward on any of these things, and we're going to get you down to three by the end of this call, okay? And you have 13 minutes. I'm just laying that out. What are things that we could do?
Well, I think for one, what Larry just described, I would say that very few of us would know anything about that. And so maybe it's an informational, a step toward better understanding what that social science database is and how then it could be employed in our extension efforts.
And maybe it's more than just becoming informed, but then also partnering with them or figuring out how we can better align ourselves for those impacts.
Fine, okay on that? What else could we do? Given these, I'll just scroll up. Sorry if I'm making you dizzy. Would we want, I don't know if there's, I'm sure there's somebody doing this, a ripple effect? Do we want to work on one project that has a ripple effect and then we could use that as a model for where we might have other ripple effects? Or maybe we could do a little bit of a lit review on are there other ripple effect studies out there, which there are, and do any of those, could any of those like influence how we explain our work? Do we just pick out, maybe this is what we do. We could just have one, like we could just have two outcomes. And one is that we pick the 3 programs we want to be more purposeful about and the rest of us don't worry about it as much. This is our chance to influence our work, folks.
Well, you know, as we were talking about data literacy, there again, that may just be an informational thing or better informed within our organization about how to improve data literacy or what efforts are going on currently at the time. And what does it mean to be more data literate, I guess, and quantifying that.
In addition to like gaining an understanding, could also be gaining access to resources and tools like Tableau or other things we might be interested in.
Anything else you want to do?
Could you scroll back up just for 1 second? Thanks.
If I make this a little smaller, can you still see it? Then we could see it all on one page. Is that better or worse?
if I lean in real close.
Yeah, I know.
Well, as I look at number 4 and reflect back on what was said, is there a way that we can more clearly define what is worth measuring, what's not worth measuring? And obviously that's kind of the general idea of this whole driver, but are there ways that we can maybe clarify that, what's meaningful and what's superfluous?
I hesitate to say programs here, but I'll use that.
If you said outcomes,
Maybe. My only hesitancy there is, let's think about it. If we really consolidated all of the time and energy we put into evaluation work and did it on a couple of big programs, we could get like solid research, publishable kinds of data that would be pretty cool. And my only concern about doing outcomes is it gets too splintered then, and it's too hard to do across program areas, but it could be.
no, that makes sense.
About the word characteristics, meaningful characteristics to measure and focus on? Is that broader and maybe not quite as...
Here's what this one says to me, and you can all disagree. I think that the combined effort that Nebraska Extension puts into evaluation would be shocking to all of us if we knew. If we thought, like, all of the stuff that we hand out and all of the work that we do toward measuring these outcomes, it's big. If we said, instead of doing all of that, Nebraska Extension, we're going to contract with an outsider, we're going to hire one of us, we'll do something. And for the next 3 years or even the next 2 years, we're going to focus on these 2 programs or 3 programs. We come up with that. I think we'd end up getting like really amazingly meaningful data. Is it going to be hard to agree on those programs? Absolutely. But think about, like, is that more of what we need? I don't know.
The other angle could be impacts. Like it's a single impact across one of the discipline areas, like a single impact across youth or across beef.
Are these the 3 outcomes that you like? So let's go back here first, and we're in decision-making time, folks. All right, the 3 outcomes. Are these the 3 outcomes? And I'm going to try to, and I don't know if I can do this. I'm going to have you vote, the 9 of you that are left. Look at how you can influence the system. All right, so you're going to vote yes or no on number 1 if we want to keep that. Can you do that? Like on the chat box or on the participant list, can you raise your hand or?
If I had to pick my first choice would be number 2. So if I go that way, that is like what stands out to me as top.
Okay.
I don't know how the rest of the group feels, but that's the one that stands out to me.
Well, we can have 3, so all you need to do is cut out 1, and I'm hearing 2 should stay. Any other feel on ones that should stay or should leave?
And I'm wondering if 2 could be split into 2 because it has multiple components.
Yeah, we can slice these and dice these later. I agree with you.
So what you wrote down before, Kathleen, about taking a couple of programs and really doing in-depth impact, that would be part of number 2?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So I would probably myself drop number 3 out. It would be my vote.
We're hearing drop number 3.
Agree?
And that would mean keeping number 4. And keeping number 1. Everybody feeling in general okay about that?
Yeah, that sounds okay. The thing that to me we need to be a little bit careful with is to understand there's a lot of different audiences that want to know impact. And if we do some big in-depth impact on statewide programs, that's wonderful. But then when I go to my extension board and they're going to say, okay, that's cool. What happened here? And so, we always need to be cognizant of the fact that we've got a lot of different, I mean, even within a county, sometimes you get one person from one community that wants to know something. And so, guy just needs to be a little careful. There's all I'm saying, that when we start looking at these big data sets that are all, showing a impact for a big group of people over a state or a region or whatever.
Yep, and I was probably a little bit too curt when I said we wouldn't have to do any other kind of impact. We're probably going to have to do some things, but maybe at least we wouldn't have to worry about it so much. You raise a really good point.
Maybe Kathleen, like where you have the note that says, can we supplement that with qualitative to show our contribution? Maybe it's and complement it with strategic local evaluation. So that if we have a big story that we're telling, then locally I can still be collecting some things that are complementary to that story.
Okay. All right, everybody okay in general on that? Let's go down to these. Are these okay for our first round? Now we might want less emphasis on number 1 now because we said that number 3 above was probably not as important to us, right?
Or is it 2 that goes away, the data literacy? Yeah.
I would say 2. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Everybody good? You'll certainly see these again, and we'll send them out after this meeting, but we just kind of wanted to get your feel. This has been really good discussion. Thank you. Jack, what else?
No, I wondered where this would take us, but I think we've come to a very good end point here as far as the status of and state of this process we're going through. So I agree, those are 3 good outcomes, and then the second part as far as recommendations. I'm comfortable with that.
Good work to the team. Thanks everybody for keeping on. More to come at Fall Conference week after next. Talk to you later. Bye.
Thanks all.